"You're in the wrong place, old man." The words sliced through the warm Carolina morning with the effortless confidence of a young Marine who had never imagined anyone would question his authority. The massive gates of Camp Lejeune stood beneath a cloudless sky, the American flag snapping sharply in a steady coastal breeze while a line of government vehicles rolled toward the security checkpoint. Staff Sergeant Ryan Brooks raised one gloved hand, signaling traffic to pause as his attention settled on the elderly man standing quietly near the entrance. He wasn't blocking anyone. He wasn't arguing. He simply stood there with his weathered hands resting on the handle of a faded leather bag, his pale blue eyes fixed on the flag climbing against the brilliant sky. The silence around him somehow felt heavier than the impatient engines idling nearby. "Sir, this is an active military installation," Brooks said, his voice louder now, meant as much for the gathering audience as for the old man himself. "You need to leave the property immediately." The elderly stranger slowly turned his head. Deep lines crossed his face like old maps drawn by decades of sun, wind, and time. His olive field jacket had long since faded into a color somewhere between green and gray, its cuffs softened by years of wear. A small, dull metal pin rested above his heart. It wasn't polished. It wasn't impressive. It looked almost forgotten. His name was Thomas Walker, 82 years old, white-haired, straight-backed despite the years pressing against his shoulders. He studied the young Marine with a calm expression that carried neither fear nor resentment. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I know exactly where I am." Brooks folded his arms. "Then you should know visitors don't stand around at the front gate without authorization." Behind him, another Marine chuckled. Maybe he thinks this is a museum tour. A few more joined the laughter. It wasn't cruel enough to sound vicious. It was worse than that. It was dismissive. They had already decided who Thomas Walker was before learning a single thing about him. More personnel waiting at the checkpoint began watching. A civilian contractor slowed his pickup truck. Two young lieutenants walking toward headquarters exchanged amused glances before stopping several yards away. Conflict had a way of attracting spectators. Thomas remained perfectly still. His attention drifted past the Marines toward the familiar buildings beyond the gate. Some had changed. Others hadn't. The parade deck still caught the morning sunlight exactly as he remembered. Even from this distance, he noticed something almost no one else would. One member of the color guard was half a pace out of alignment during the morning movement across the far side of the installation. His eyes lingered there for only a second before returning to the young Marines confronting him. Brooks noticed the glance and smirked. "Looking for somebody?" Thomas nodded once. "Someone asked me to stop by." "Who?" Brooks asked. Thomas answered without hesitation. "The Commandant." The Marines stared at him for a heartbeat before laughter spread through the checkpoint. One corporal actually shook his head, unable to contain himself. "The Commandant asked you personally?" Brooks said. "That's your story?" Thomas simply nodded again. "He said he'd want to see me if I was ever nearby." The breeze carried the distant rhythm of cadence calls from somewhere deeper inside the base. Helicopter rotors hummed faintly beyond the tree line. Everything about the installation moved with practiced precision. Everything except the strange stillness surrounding the old man. Brooks stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Listen carefully, sir. The Commandant doesn't invite random civilians to drop by. So I'm asking one last time. Walk away before this becomes a bigger problem." Thomas looked at the young Marine with quiet eyes that had witnessed far more mornings than Brooks could imagine. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he reached up and brushed a thumb across the worn metal pin on his jacket, as though greeting an old memory that had never truly left him. Thomas let his hand fall away from the old pin without offering another explanation. He had learned long ago that some truths only became believable when the right person heard them. Around the checkpoint, the mood shifted from casual amusement to open impatience. The line of vehicles waiting to enter the installation grew longer, their engines humming beneath the bright morning sun. A delivery truck driver leaned out his window to see what was causing the delay, while several Marines carrying equipment cases slowed their pace just enough to watch the exchange unfold. Staff Sergeant Ryan Brooks exhaled sharply and rested one hand on his duty belt. "You are holding up traffic for an imaginary appointment," he said. "This conversation is over." Thomas remained composed. His eyes drifted once more toward the familiar streets beyond the gate. The new buildings blended with structures that had stood there for decades, yet certain details never escaped him. A fresh coat of paint covered one training facility, but the flagpole stood exactly where it always had. The old oak near headquarters had grown wider. Even the morning breeze carried the same faint scent of pine mixed with salt from the Atlantic that he remembered from another lifetime. Brooks noticed the old man's distant expression and mistook it for confusion. "Do you even remember where you are?" he asked. Thomas answered almost absent-mindedly. The Memorial Garden used to be 30 yards farther east before the expansion. The words landed awkwardly. One young corporal frowned and looked toward the center of the base as though trying to picture it. Another Marine laughed. "Lucky guess." A second lieutenant approached from headquarters after noticing the growing crowd. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer was young, confident, and freshly assigned to the installation. His uniform looked as though it had never known a wrinkle. "What seems to be the issue, Staff Sergeant?" Brooks pointed toward Thomas. "Claims the Commandant invited him here." Mercer raised an eyebrow before turning toward the elderly visitor. "Sir, do you have any written authorization?" Thomas slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Several Marines instinctively stiffened until he carefully removed a folded piece of paper. Mercer accepted it, unfolded it, and immediately frowned. It was not an invitation. It was an old highway map of eastern North Carolina with faded creases and handwritten notes covering the margins. Brooks shook his head with visible frustration. "That is not exactly helping your case." Thomas accepted the map after Mercer handed it back. "No," he replied softly. "I suppose it is not." The lieutenant crossed his arms. "Then I think it is time for you to leave before military police become involved." Thomas gave a polite nod, but made no effort to move. His attention settled briefly on the young Marines standing nearby. They reminded him of another generation, equally confident, equally certain that every answer could be found inside a manual. He did not resent them. Youth often mistook certainty for wisdom. Near the edge of the checkpoint, Captain Ethan Collins had been walking toward headquarters when the unusual gathering caught his attention. He slowed without announcing himself, observing quietly from several yards away. What first drew his attention was not the argument. It was the old man's posture. Thomas stood completely relaxed, neither defensive nor intimidated. Collins had spent enough years in uniform to recognize something unusual in that quiet confidence. Then his eyes settled on the weathered pin resting above the faded jacket pocket. He could not identify it, but he knew enough military history to realize it did not resemble a souvenir. It looked worn by decades rather than collected for display. While Brooks continued insisting that the visitor leave immediately, Collins found himself studying the old man instead of the confrontation. Something about Thomas Walker did not fit the story everyone else had already decided to believe. Captain Ethan Collins did not step forward immediately. Years in uniform had taught him that the loudest voice in a confrontation rarely carried the clearest picture. Instead, he remained just outside the growing circle of Marines, quietly observing details that everyone else ignored. Thomas Walker never shifted his weight in frustration. He never raised his voice. He never looked toward the gathering audience, searching for sympathy. His attention wandered across the installation with the calm familiarity of someone revisiting an old hometown rather than entering a restricted military base. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer mistook the silence for stubbornness. "Sir, I am giving you a lawful instruction," he said firmly. "If you remain here, military police will escort you off the installation." Thomas looked directly at the young officer. His expression remained almost gentle. "I have no intention of making anyone's morning more difficult." Brooks let out a dry laugh. "You already have." The surrounding Marines nodded in quiet agreement. To them, the situation was simple. An elderly civilian had wandered onto government property with an unbelievable story. Procedures existed for exactly this kind of problem. Rules did not bend because someone appeared polite. Thomas slowly lowered his leather bag onto the concrete beside his boots. The bag landed with a soft thump that sounded surprisingly familiar to Collins, as though it had been carried for decades instead of months. The old man unfastened one weathered buckle, searching carefully inside. Brooks immediately raised a hand. "Do not remove anything unless I tell you to." Thomas paused without complaint. "It is only a pair of reading glasses." Brooks hesitated before nodding. Thomas retrieved the glasses, unfolded them with steady hands, and slipped them on. Then he reached into the same compartment once more and pulled out a folded photograph no larger than a postcard. Before anyone could object, he studied it for only a second before placing it back inside the bag. Collins caught only a brief glimpse. Several young Marines standing shoulder to shoulder beside an aging helicopter, faces smiling beneath helmets. The image disappeared before he could make out a single name. Mercer frowned. Family. Thomas smiled faintly. Something like that. Brooks had clearly lost his patience. Enough. Pick up your bag and leave. Thomas looked toward the parade field beyond the security gate. Morning drills continued with mechanical precision. Commands echoed across the installation, carried by the wind until they dissolved into the distant rhythm of marching boots. The cadence has changed, Thomas said quietly. Different from years ago. Mercer exchanged an amused glance with Brooks. You have been here before? Thomas nodded once. Long ago. As a visitor? Mercer asked. Thomas answered after a brief pause. Not exactly. The vague response only deepened their skepticism. Brooks folded his arms tighter across his chest. You keep speaking in riddles. Thomas simply shrugged. Only because the truth sounds strange before people are ready to hear it. The remark drew another round of quiet laughter from several younger Marines. Collins did not laugh. His eyes remained fixed on the small worn pin above Thomas's heart. The shape tugged at an old memory buried somewhere inside years of leadership courses, historical briefings, and museum visits. He could not place it. Yet something about the battered piece of metal refused to leave his thoughts. Unlike official decorations, it carried no polished finish, no recognizable emblem, and no ceremonial ribbon. It looked personal, earned rather than issued. Collins finally stepped closer. Mr. Walker, he said calmly. Thomas turned toward him. Would you mind telling me where you got that pin? For the first time since arriving at the gate, Thomas's hand instinctively rose to the weathered piece of metal resting against his jacket. His fingertips lingered there with extraordinary care, as though touching something far more valuable than gold. His eyes drifted beyond the checkpoint, beyond the buildings, beyond the present itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost lost beneath the distant sound of helicopter rotors crossing the Carolina sky. A young Marine gave it to me on a rainy afternoon, he said softly. He insisted I keep it because he believed neither of us would ever forget what happened that day. He was right. I never did. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The steady chop of helicopter blades drifted across the base before fading into the distance, leaving only the rustle of the flag above the gate and the faint rumble of waiting engines. Captain Ethan Collins kept his eyes on the worn metal pin while Thomas Walker lowered his hand from it with almost ceremonial care. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer finally broke the silence with a skeptical smile. A touching story, he said. But stories are not credentials. Several Marines nearby nodded in agreement. Staff Sergeant Ryan Brooks glanced toward the growing line of vehicles stacking up outside the checkpoint. His patience had nearly disappeared. Captain, we have delayed traffic long enough. We need to clear the gate. Collins did not answer immediately. His instincts continued pulling him in the opposite direction. There was something about the old man's measured words that refused to fit the picture everyone else had accepted. Thomas had never exaggerated. He had never claimed fame. He had never demanded recognition. If anything, he seemed almost reluctant to explain himself. Mercer stepped closer until he stood directly in front of Thomas. His eyes settled on the weathered pin attached to the faded jacket. May I see that? He asked. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before giving a slow nod. Carefully, Mercer reached out, unclipped the small piece of metal, and held it between two fingers. Several younger Marines leaned in with curiosity. Up close, it looked even less impressive than before. The edges were uneven. Tiny scratches covered every surface. There were no official markings, no serial number, no polished finish that suggested military importance. It resembled nothing more than a bent fragment of dull metal that someone had shaped decades earlier. Brooks gave a short laugh. This is what all the mystery is about. One corporal shrugged. Looks like scrap. Another Marine smiled. Probably came out of an old toolbox. Mercer turned the object over several times before holding it toward the sunlight. There is not even an insignia. Thomas watched quietly. There never needed to be. Mercer looked back at him. Then why keep it for so many years? Thomas answered with the same calm certainty that had never left his voice. Because promises do not always come with paperwork. The words only deepened the confusion. Brooks extended his hand. "Give it here." Mercer passed him the small piece of metal. Brooks examined it for only a second before carelessly tapping one edge with his thumb. "I have seen challenge coins, unit patches, retirement gifts. This is none of those." He lightly flicked the pin with his finger. The tiny metallic sound rang through the quiet checkpoint with surprising clarity. Thomas did not react outwardly, but something changed behind his pale blue eyes. The cheerful summer morning disappeared from his thoughts. In its place came another sky, filled with heavy rain clouds. The smell of fresh pavement faded beneath the memory of soaked earth, damp canvas, aviation fuel, and the sharp scent of wet pine carried by mountain wind. He could almost hear young voices calling to one another through the rain, steady and determined despite exhaustion. A young Marine officer, his face streaked with mud and water, pressed the rough piece of metal into Thomas's hand with a grateful smile that carried more emotion than words ever could. "Keep it," the young officer had insisted. "If either of us makes it home, I want one reminder that somebody still believed we would." The memory lingered only for an instant before the checkpoint returned around him. Brooks was still holding the pin without understanding what it represented. Captain Collins noticed the subtle change in Thomas's expression. It was not sadness. It was not anger. It was the distant look of someone revisiting a chapter of life too important to ever become ordinary. Collins felt a quiet uneasiness settle into his chest. Whatever this forgotten piece of metal truly meant, he became certain of one thing. Everyone standing at that gate was looking at it for the wrong reason. The faint metallic ring still seemed to linger in the air long after Staff Sergeant Ryan Brooks lowered the worn pin into his palm. Around the checkpoint, conversations faded one by one until even the waiting drivers outside the gate sensed that something unusual had settled over the morning. Thomas Walker stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing steady, his eyes no longer focused on the Marines surrounding him, but somewhere far beyond the neat rows of buildings stretching across the installation. The years quietly slipped away inside his mind. The bright Carolina sunshine dissolved into endless gray. Skies heavy with rain. Cold drops struck canvas, steel, and soaked uniforms while thick mountain fog swallowed everything more than a few yards away. The steady rhythm of helicopter rotors echoed across the valley, not as a display for visitors, but as the sound every Marine waited to hear. Young faces appeared through the rain, exhausted yet determined. They moved with the silent understanding that comes only from people who had learned to depend on one another without needing many words. Thomas was decades younger then, carrying the same weathered leather bag, although it had not yet become faded with age. He knelt beside a damaged field radio while several Marines gathered around him beneath a dripping camouflage net. The equipment had failed at the worst possible moment, and every pair of eyes rested on him with quiet hope rather than panic. He worked patiently, listening before touching anything, studying each connection as though the machine itself were speaking. After several careful adjustments, the radio crackled back to life. Relief spread across every face. No cheering followed, only grateful smiles and tired nods. Among them stood a young Marine captain whose calm leadership held the group together despite the miserable weather. He stepped toward Thomas after the successful repair, reached into his own pocket, and removed a rough piece of bent metal no larger than a silver dollar. It had once belonged to a damaged piece of equipment that all of them believed had been beyond saving. The captain rubbed one thumb across its uneven surface before placing it into Thomas's hand. "This will never appear in any ceremony," the young officer said with a quiet smile. "Nobody will understand why it matters except the people standing here today. Keep it anyway." Thomas looked down at the simple piece of metal before closing his fingers around it. "You should keep it," he answered. The captain shook his head. "No. Every time I see it, I will only remember the problem. Every time you see it, remember the people." Rain continued falling around them, while the young Marines silently nodded their agreement. The little piece of metal became less an object than a promise, shared between people who trusted one another completely. The memory slowly faded as another gust of warm Carolina wind swept across the checkpoint. Thomas blinked once, returning fully to the present. Staff Sergeant Brooks was still holding the pin with puzzled disappointment. To him it remained nothing more than a battered fragment without value. Captain Ethan Collins watched Thomas carefully. He noticed the old man's eyes glisten for only an instant before settling once again into their familiar calm. Whatever memory had surfaced had clearly carried tremendous weight. Collins extended his hand toward Brooks. "May I see it?" Brooks shrugged and handed over the small piece of metal. Collins studied every scratch beneath the sunlight. Along one worn edge, nearly erased by time, he noticed something he had missed before. Tiny hand-carved letters, uneven and shallow, almost invisible unless the light struck them perfectly. He tilted the pen slightly and narrowed his eyes. He could not read the entire inscription, but one word remained unmistakably clear despite the passing decades. It simply read, "Honor." Captain Ethan Collins held the weathered pen beneath the morning sunlight, rotating it slowly until the faint carving caught the light once again. The tiny word was barely visible, almost erased by decades of worn fabric and careful hands, yet it remained unmistakable. Honor. Not engraved by a machine, carved by hand. Collins felt a quiet chill despite the warm Carolina air. This was no souvenir purchased from a gift shop. Someone had taken the time to mark it with purpose. He looked back at Thomas Walker, who simply waited without asking for the pen to be returned. There was no urgency in his posture, no attempt to explain himself. It was as though he had already accepted that the object would either mean everything or nothing, depending on who happened to be looking at it. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer glanced at Collins with growing impatience. "Captain, it is still just a piece of scrap metal." Collins nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the carving. "Maybe." He turned the pen over once more. Along the back edge, beneath years of scratches, another faint marking appeared. Only 2 letters remained visible. The rest had been worn smooth by time. They looked less like initials and more like part of an old identification code. Collins searched his memory. He had seen similar markings somewhere before. Not in a history book. Not in a museum. Somewhere inside headquarters. Somewhere connected to Marine Corps heritage. Brooks folded his arms. "We have wasted enough time already." Collins finally looked up. "Do me a favor. Hold traffic for another minute." Brooks frowned. "For what?" Collins carefully placed the pen into Thomas's open palm. "Because I would rather spend 1 extra minute asking questions than spend years wishing I had." Thomas closed his fingers gently around the old metal. "That is usually a wise habit, Captain." Collins pulled his phone from his pocket and stepped several yards away from the checkpoint. He did not call military police. He did not contact base security. Instead, he opened the internal directory and searched for the Heritage and Historical Office located inside headquarters. After 2 rings, a calm civilian voice answered. "Marine Corps Heritage Office." Collins kept his voice low. "This is Captain Ethan Collins at the front gate. I have an unusual question." He briefly described the worn pen, including the hand-carved word and the partial letters on the reverse side. Silence followed for several seconds. Then papers shuffled rapidly across the other end of the line. "Captain," the voice finally replied, noticeably more serious than before. "Can you repeat those letters?" Collins did. Another pause. Longer this time. He could hear a keyboard clicking rapidly. "Do not speculate," the historian said quietly. "Can you tell me who is carrying that item?" Collins glanced toward Thomas, who still stood peacefully beneath the flag while the younger Marines watched with increasing confusion. An elderly gentleman named Thomas Walker. The keyboard stopped instantly. Complete silence filled the phone. Collins frowned. "Hello." The reply came back almost as a whisper. "Did you say Thomas Walker?" "Yes." The historian inhaled sharply. "Captain, I cannot verify identities over an unsecured line, but I strongly recommend you contact headquarters immediately. Do not ask him to leave. Do not allow him to walk away until someone from senior leadership has been notified." Collins felt his heartbeat quicken. "Who exactly is he?" The answer came carefully, every word measured. "I am not the person authorized to explain that. But if the name and that pin belong together, someone very high in the chain of command will want to know he is standing at your front gate." Collins slowly lowered the phone, his eyes returning to Thomas Walker. Across the checkpoint, the old veteran quietly watched the American flag ripple against the bright blue sky, as though he had already known that sooner or later, someone would remember. Captain Ethan Collins slipped his phone back into his pocket without saying a word. The warning from the Heritage Office echoed in his mind with unsettling clarity. Do not allow him to walk away. Those 6 words carried more weight than any regulation he had read since earning his commission. He turned toward Staff Sergeant Ryan Brooks, whose patience had finally given way to visible frustration. "Captain," Brooks asked, "what did they say?" Collins chose his words carefully. "They told me to notify headquarters immediately." Lieutenant Daniel Mercer frowned. "For an elderly civilian?" Collins met his eyes. "For Thomas Walker." Mercer folded his arms. "With respect, Captain, we have a schedule to keep. We cannot stop the front gate every time someone tells an interesting story." Collins did not argue. Instead, he removed his secure phone and opened the command contact directory reserved for operational matters. The surrounding Marines watched with growing curiosity as he selected headquarters operations rather than base security. The call connected almost immediately. "Operations Center. Captain Ethan Collins at the main gate," he replied. "I need verification on an individual currently outside the installation. The Heritage Office instructed me to report his presence directly through command channels." The duty officer sounded mildly annoyed. "Name: Thomas Walker." Silence followed. Keyboard clicks echoed faintly through the speaker. Collins waited. Across the checkpoint, Thomas remained exactly where he had stood all morning, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his weathered leather bag, while the Carolina breeze stirred the edges of his faded jacket. Waiting had never seemed to trouble him. Finally, the duty officer returned. His tone had changed completely. "Captain, remain on the line." Collins heard another voice enter the room. Then another. Someone repeated the name Thomas Walker. Chairs moved. A door opened. The calm rhythm of routine administration dissolved into urgent but controlled activity. Brooks noticed Collins's expression tighten. "Something wrong?" he whispered. Collins gave only a slight shake of his head. He no longer trusted his own assumptions. 30 seconds later, another voice came onto the line, older and unmistakably authoritative. "Captain Collins, this is Colonel Richard Hale from headquarters." Collins stood straighter without thinking. "Yes, Colonel." "Confirm the individual has identified himself as Thomas Walker." "Yes, sir." "Approximately 80 years old?" "Yes, sir." "White hair, olive field jacket, carrying a worn leather bag." Collins slowly looked toward Thomas. Every detail matched perfectly. "Yes, sir." Another pause followed, shorter this time. "Captain, listen carefully. Under no circumstances is Mr. Walker to be asked to leave the gate. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "Do not escort him away. Do not process him as a civilian trespasser. I am notifying senior leadership immediately." The line disconnected before Collins could ask another question. Around him, nothing outwardly had changed. The flag still snapped overhead. Cars continued idling beyond the checkpoint. A pair of helicopters crossed high above the tree line, their distant rotor wash blending into the warm summer air. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely different. Brooks stepped closer. "Captain, what is going on?" Collins answered honestly. "I do not know." Mercer gave a skeptical laugh. "This is getting blown completely out of proportion." Before Collins could respond, another secure phone inside the checkpoint began ringing. Then Brooks's radio crackled. A dispatcher requested confirmation that Thomas Walker remained at the gate. Seconds later, the administrative office inside the security building called with the exact same question. Marines exchanged uncertain glances. Routine had quietly disappeared. Somewhere beyond the gate, inside headquarters, a chain of conversations had already begun climbing higher than anyone standing there could yet imagine. Thomas Walker simply looked toward the rows of American flags lining the distant memorial walk, a faint smile touching the corners of his face, not because he expected recognition, but because after all these years, someone had finally started asking the right questions. The atmosphere at the front gate no longer resembled the beginning of an ordinary workday. Every few moments, another secure phone rang somewhere inside the checkpoint building. Radios crackled with clipped acknowledgments before falling silent again. Marines who had arrived expecting a routine morning found themselves speaking in lowered voices without understanding why. Staff Sergeant Ryan Brooks checked his watch for what felt like the 10th time, then looked toward Captain Ethan Collins. "Sir, should I reopen the traffic lanes?" Collins kept his eyes on Thomas Walker. "Not yet." Brooks nodded reluctantly. Even Lieutenant Daniel Mercer had stopped making jokes. Whatever had begun as an inconvenience had quietly become something neither rank nor procedure seemed prepared to explain. Thomas stood beneath the flag exactly as he had from the beginning. He neither watched the checkpoint nor the growing audience surrounding him. Instead, his gaze rested on the rows of oak trees lining the road toward headquarters. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass mixed with warm asphalt and distant salt air from the Atlantic coast. It reminded him that some places changed their buildings, but never their spirit. Several minutes passed before the deep rumble of approaching engines rolled across the installation. Heads turned almost instinctively. A convoy of dark government sport utility vehicles appeared at the far end of the boulevard, moving with calm precision rather than urgency. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, no unnecessary display of authority. The vehicles simply advanced with the quiet confidence of people who never needed to announce their importance. Brooks straightened immediately. Mercer did the same. Every Marine at the checkpoint instinctively adjusted posture without receiving a single command. The lead vehicle slowed as it reached the security gate. Before it came to a complete stop, the rear passenger door opened. A senior general officer stepped onto the pavement wearing service dress blues that seemed almost untouched by the summer heat. His silver hair reflected the morning sunlight, and every movement carried the effortless composure that decades of command had shaped. Nobody at the checkpoint recognized why he had arrived so quickly, but everyone recognized the authority his presence carried. Captain Collins snapped to attention and rendered a salute. "Good morning, General." The general returned the salute without taking his eyes off Thomas Walker. "At ease, Captain." His voice was calm, almost unusually calm. He walked past Collins, past Brooks, past Lieutenant Mercer, past every waiting Marine without asking a single question. The checkpoint fell completely silent except for the distant flutter of the American flag overhead. Thomas finally turned toward the approaching officer. For the first time that morning, a faint expression of recognition appeared on his weathered face. The general stopped several feet away. He studied the old veteran carefully, taking in the faded jacket, the worn leather bag, and finally the small hand-carved pin resting once again above Thomas's heart. The corners of his mouth softened into a quiet smile. "I was told there might be a misunderstanding," he said gently. Thomas answered with the same peaceful tone that had never once changed. "Young Marines are supposed to protect the gate. They were only doing their job." Several Marines lowered their eyes. No accusation had been made. No complaint had been offered. Yet the words seemed heavier than any reprimand. The general gave a slow nod before reaching into the inside pocket of his dress coat. He removed a small leather folder and opened it. Inside rested an aged photograph protected beneath clear plastic. It showed 5 young Marines standing shoulder to shoulder in steady rain beside a field radio and a helicopter. One of them was unmistakably Thomas Walker, many decades younger. Another face had been circled in faded blue ink. The general looked from the photograph back to Thomas. "I thought it was you," he said quietly. Around the checkpoint, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every Marine present sensed that the moment they had all been waiting for had finally arrived, even if none of them yet understood just how extraordinary the next few seconds would become. The senior general closed the leather folder with deliberate care before taking one slow step closer to Thomas Walker. The morning breeze carried the sound of the flag snapping overhead, but no one at the checkpoint seemed to hear it anymore. Every Marine stood motionless, their attention fixed on the 2 older men facing one another beneath the entrance sign. Captain Ethan Collins watched in complete silence. Staff Sergeant Ryan Brooks no longer wore the confidence that had defined the morning. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer stared at the faded photograph still resting in the general's hand, trying to understand how an elderly stranger had suddenly become the center of attention for some of the highest levels of the Marine Corps. The general looked into Thomas's weathered eyes and smiled with unmistakable respect. "You probably knew this would happen eventually," he said quietly. Thomas returned a faint smile. "Eventually takes longer than people expect." The general nodded. "It certainly does." He carefully slipped the photograph back into its case before straightening his uniform. Then, without hesitation and without looking toward anyone else, he came to full attention directly in front of Thomas Walker. Every Marine at the checkpoint instinctively stiffened. Captain Collins felt his pulse quicken. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The general slowly raised his right hand in a flawless Marine salute. His voice carried clearly across the silent checkpoint. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." Time itself seemed to stop. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Staff Sergeant Brooks stared in disbelief. Lieutenant Mercer felt every assumption he had made that morning collapse in complete silence. Thomas looked at the general for several seconds before gently returning the salute. His movements were slower now than they had once been, shaped by age rather than youth, yet they carried a quiet precision that no passing year had erased. The two men lowered their hands together. The general smiled warmly. The young captain in that photograph never forgot what you taught him. He became the commandant years later. Before he retired, he made sure your name remained in our private historical records. He always said there was one man he could never properly thank. Thomas's eyes rested on the photograph for only a moment. He became exactly the leader I hoped he would become. The general nodded. He also left instructions. If Thomas Walker ever returned to this base, he was never to be treated as a visitor. He was to be welcomed as family. An overwhelming silence settled over the checkpoint. Brooks slowly removed his campaign cover, holding it respectfully against his chest. Mercer lowered his eyes, searching for words that refused to come. Captain Collins stepped toward Thomas. "Mr. Walker," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology." Thomas shook his head before Collins could continue. "No, Captain. You asked questions before making conclusions. Keep doing that. The Corps will always need officers who think before they judge." Collins absorbed the words more carefully than any formal lesson he had received at school. Brooks finally stepped forward. His voice was quiet now, stripped of every trace of arrogance. "Sir, I am sorry." Thomas smiled kindly. "You protected your post. Never apologize for doing your duty with honest intentions. Just remember that experience does not always arrive wearing medals." Several Marines nearby quietly nodded. None of them would forget those words. The general reached for Thomas's weathered leather bag before the old veteran could lift it himself. Thomas chuckled softly. "You do not have to carry that." The general answered with another respectful smile. "Today, sir, it would be my privilege." Together, they began walking through the gates while every Marine present stood silently at attention. No command had been given. None was necessary. The only sound was the steady breeze moving through the flag above them, as the morning sunlight stretched long shadows across the pavement. Some lessons could never be taught inside a classroom, and some salutes carried far more than military courtesy. They carried memory, gratitude, and the quiet understanding that true honor never asks to be recognized. It simply waits for the right people to remember.